Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for coming tonight to the State Senate Candidate, District 49 Candidate Forum. My name is Debbie McNeil, and I'm the president of the League of Women Voters, Edina. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan volunteer organization, and we encourage the informed and active participation by citizens in their government. The League does studies and does take positions on issues, but we do not support candidates or political parties. All of the opinions expressed here tonight will be those of the candidates and not those of the League of Women Voters. Finally, it's my pleasure to introduce to you the moderator for tonight's forum, Marty Mix of the League of Women Voters, Golden Valley. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. The purpose of this evening's forum is to provide an opportunity for the candidates to discuss issues that are important to you. We will try to cover as many issues as possible in the time that we have. If your questions are not addressed tonight, feel free to contact the candidates directly. All candidates who filed for office and who will be on the November 6th ballot were invited to this forum for the Senate 49 position. I'd like now to explain the rules and format of tonight's forum. Candidates have drawn numbers to determine speaking order. Speaking order will rotate with each question, and Melissa Franson was the person who picked number 1, so she'll be the first to speak for opening statements. Each candidate will have 2 minutes to make an opening statement and 2 minutes to answer the first question, which was sent out in advance. Candidates will then have 1 minute to answer each question submitted by the audience. Each candidate will have 2 minutes to make a closing statement. A League volunteer will time the candidate response and indicate to candidates when they have 1 minute remaining and 30 seconds remaining and when they must stop. So can both the candidates see where our timers are? Perfect. And obviously, when they say stop, you may feel free to finish your sentence. Just don't go on for another sentence. Audience questions must be in writing and handed to a volunteer who is wearing a League button, and the moderator will ask all the questions. The League of Women Voter of Edina determines which questions will be asked and attempts in good faith to cover the topics of interest indicated by the questions submitted from the audience. All written questions become the property of the League of Women Voters of Edina. This forum is being videotaped, so please hold your applause until the end of the forum. I'd like now to introduce the candidates, Keith Downey and Melissa Franson. We will begin our opening remarks with Melissa Franson, and you will have 2 minutes.
Thank you. I want to start by thanking the League of Women Voters for hosting what has become a Minnesota tradition, a substantive debate on the issues. I am running for the state senate because our district needs a moderate voice, an independent voice, and not an extreme ideological voice that's out of touch with our district. My background is in business. I'm an attorney at Target Corporation in government affairs, where my responsibility is analyzing legislation and regulation at the state, local, and federal levels of government. I also have experience in small energy business with my husband, Nathan. We live in this great community and we love our community. That is why my husband and I picked to live in this community. We're active and engaged. We have some of the highest voter turnout in the state, which we should be proud of. We enjoy great quality of life, and we have great schools. Since I launched my campaign, I've knocked on more than 5,000 doors, and I've talked to many of you. And I hear that you're really frustrated. And you're frustrated and have lost confidence in the legislature that's locked up into extreme ideology. I'm frustrated too. My opponent has left us with a stagnant economy, high unemployment, the longest government shutdown on Minnesota record. And he's on record stating that he pulled a gimmick to make the state budget look more balanced than it really is. Now let me tell you that my approach as your state senator will be dramatically different. I will bring honest leadership and a spirit of collaboration to the Senate so that we can achieve sensible solutions to the challenges that we face and get things done. As a businesswoman, I will support jobs and growth. I will support education. It will be one of my top priorities. And I will begin to pay back the school shift. I will make sure that we balance the budget honestly instead of using gimmicks. Thank you.
Thank you. Keith Downey.
Thank you, and thank you to everyone for coming, and thank you too to the league. I know how much work it is to pull these things off, so appreciate the chance to be here tonight. Real briefly, just from a personal standpoint, I actually was born and raised here in Edina, attended the old Edina East High School, believe it or not. I have 3 kids, a daughter who's in college, a daughter who's a senior in high school, and a son who's a 9th grader at Southview. And people always ask me, so I'll tell you, yes, my dad is Mr. Downey from Southview High School, or Southview Middle School. And yes, I actually did cook burgers at the Convention Grill for my summer job. So whether those are attributes or not, you can decide. I ran for office 4 years ago for a couple of reasons. And one is I sensed that we were beginning to lose our competitive edge here in Minnesota. And the other was that as a consultant to state and local governments, I saw 2 huge problems. One, we were asking very large bureaucracies to accomplish a lot that, frankly, they aren't very well equipped to accomplish. And 2, the politicians seem to be totally disconnected from that. And when they would pass their legislation and hold their press conferences and celebrate the wonderful things that their legislation would do, very rarely did they ever follow up to make sure that it was accomplished. And frankly, from my perspective, very rarely did it. So I was fortunate to be elected 4 years ago. Our situation, frankly, hasn't changed a lot. We still have very serious, big, complex problems with a $60 billion biennial organization down at the state. The solutions are big and complex. They require a lot of time. The political process often is not what you might like from the public's eye, but we have made some progress. We have a $1 billion surplus this year as a starting point for our next budget, and we have $2 billion of new revenue from existing taxes with which to tackle our budget. So we have some big challenges. We still have the problems that we face, but I think we're positioned to do it, and with the hard work that I want to put in, we can make it happen.
Thank you very much. We will now begin the question that was sent in advance. And this question says, what specific measures would you support to reduce the state budget deficit and to repay the money owed to school districts? And we'll begin with Keith Downey.
Thank you. There's actually a budget resolution for you to take a look at out on the table, a proposal that I submitted as a bill last year, and that I think makes great sense again this year. So I'm offering it up tonight for discussion and consideration with my opponent. As I mentioned, we have a $1 billion surplus in this biennium. It has replenished our budget and cash reserves. We have $900 million more in our reserves than we had planned for in our original budget. We also, unbeknownst to most folks, but you can look at the Minnesota Management and Budget Forecast, have $2 billion more of tax revenue coming in for the next 2-year period than we had in the last 2-year period. That's a 6% increase. We spent $34 billion in our state budget from the general fund last budget period. We've got $36 billion to spend. I believe that with $2 billion of new money and that with a budget reserve that we haven't had for years, that we are in a position to have a nice, adequate increase in our state budget and make substantial progress towards paying down the school shift. And actually, if we didn't cut a thing, not one single budget cut, we take that surplus and we take that new tax revenue that we have coming in, we could actually pay off the entire shift in 2 years. Now, you might disagree with that as a priority. You might argue for other priorities in our state budget, but we have the financial wherewithal right now to solve this budget challenge and put ourselves on a much more structurally sustainable footing. There's also a reform roadmap that I've published that I've offered as a bill as well that lists 20 different initiatives that if we implemented them successfully at the state, we actually could make even more progress. And if we did it right, we'd have another $1.5 billion for this budget cycle. So I think we are well positioned to address this challenge this year.
Thank you very much. Melissa Franzen.
Thank you. I will tackle the budget and work on balancing it honestly and without gimmicks. Let's be honest, we don't have a surplus, and come January 1st, we owe $4.5 projected billion deficit. So in order to tackle the budget, we need to grow our economy, there's no question. How do we do that? By providing the environment for businesses to hire and grow jobs. Another option that we have failed to implement is to compromise. It's going to take Democrats and Republicans to come together to tackle this issue. It's not going to be solved by one party or the other. And I believe that that compromise needs to happen. There are things that on the table that did not pass this last legislative session that had bipartisan support, but given our legislative majorities, were not able to pass through. Southwest Corridor is an investment in infrastructure that would create jobs, and I completely support such a project. The e-fairness legislation, which also had bipartisan support and would have brought about $10 million each biennium. These are low-hanging fruit and smart solutions and investments in order to grow our economy. I hope that we can start by electing people that are willing to compromise, that are going to be in the middle of the road and are going to be people who are going to be bridge makers versus seeing the divisiveness that we've seen in the last legislative session. Those are things that we need to tackle together, and again, it's going to take a coalition of people who are willing to work together. And I want to be part of that, and that is why I'm running.
Thank you. Well, we begin with our first question from the audience. What is your position on the Southwest Light Rail Corridor? And I will ask Melissa Franson first.
Great segue. So as I said, I strongly support the Southwest Corridor. It's a project that would bring about 60,000 jobs just along the corridor line, new jobs. It's not counting construction jobs. It's got bipartisan support, chambers of commerce supported, and the affected or impacted cities and mayors supported as well. It should have been part of the bonding bill when we actually could have bonded at a very cheap rate. We keep sending money to Washington, but we want to bring it back to Minnesota, and this is a perfect example of how we could do it. The cost of this project, it would cost $125 million. It's not cheap, but it's also an investment in our long-term infrastructure and transportation needs. I believe we need to think long-term and have a vision for what we need to do with our transportation needs and congestion, and this is one part of the mix. We can't build roads fast enough, and this is a project that I completely support.
Thank you. Keith Downey.
Thank you. I have some personal experience with the Southwest Light Rail Corridor. I was appointed by the Minneapolis Regional Chamber to the Policy Advisory Committee, and so I followed that project in quite a bit of detail along with the other rail lines. And while I am a supporter of a multimodal transportation system in the Twin Cities, I think we need to take a critical look at where our investments are going and which ones are going to actually produce real congestion relieving value for our community. We will, if we fund the Southwest Light Rail and implement it, spend $4 billion. And just because it came from the federal government doesn't mean it's free money. $4 billion on rail projects, one of which, the North Star Corridor, is arguably struggling, perhaps even failing. I think we need to look at the new line as it comes on in the Central Corridor. We need to look at the economics and the congestion relieving value and decide whether or not perhaps fixing the interchange at 35W and 494 or fixing the interchange at 94 in downtown Minneapolis might not be better investments than the Southwest Light Rail line. And if we do that, we'll make a good decision.
Thank you. All right, here's our next question. What do you think of the 2 constitutional amendments on the Minnesota ballot this November? And we begin with Keith Downey.
I voted to put both of the amendments on the ballot. I think the marriage amendment is maybe front of mind for some people, and I believe that with the current state law, the change that voters would be asked to make really wouldn't change that, and so we're really asking the people of Minnesota to validate what is currently in state law. I think that's entirely appropriate when you think about the alternative of having the courts and lawyers and politicians deciding that. I'm much more comfortable with the people of Minnesota deciding it. For others, the photo ID amendment is more important. We've had a long history in this country going all the way back to the Bush Gore election in 2000, where there was a serious crisis of confidence in our election system. Jimmy Carter and James Baker, no less, presided over a commission that recommended photo ID literally 8 years ago. 16 states nationally have it. It is part of a national move to increase the integrity of our elections. I think it's a great
Thank
move,
you.
and I think the supporters of it are massively overstating the potential
Thank you.
implications of it.
Thank you. Okay, Melissa Franzen.
Sure. On the marriage amendment, I am completely opposed to the amendment. I think it's outrageous that we're actually trying to insert divisiveness and discrimination to our fabric of our Constitution. That is not Minnesota values. That is not where our priorities should be. It's an important issue. I've heard it at the door that all of you really do care about that issue, but that you don't want this to be on our Constitution. We're at a time where we have lots of big challenges, and we need the best from everybody. And this is not something that is going to bring the best from everybody. We need to make sure that we are open and have tolerance in our community, and this is not the right way to go. On the voter ID, I also oppose the voter ID amendment. I believe that this is a perfect example of something that could have been tackled legislatively, and we couldn't find compromise. I'm all for making sure that we have great laws and have voter integrity, but this is something that was punted to us so we can do the work for our failed leadership in our legislature.
Thank you. All right, the next question, again, we begin with Melissa Franzen. Will you support development of a Minnesota health insurance exchange rather than waiting for the federal government to act?
Sure, this issue is actually something that I'm pretty familiar with the work that I do in government affairs. I've handled healthcare reform implementation for the last 2 years. So I do see this as something that we need to have leadership in. We've been stalling over the last 2 years when businesses need predictability and certainty. And we do want something that works for Minnesota. We are number ones in healthcare, and we want to continue to preserve that. But if we stall and let other states do their thing or have a federally facilitated exchange, Minnesota is going to lag. So we need to continue to work together, find compromise and common ground to implement healthcare exchanges that work for Minnesota, not have a federally facilitated exchange. So I'm supportive of having a Minnesota-based exchange.
Thank you. Keith Downey.
Well, I think the question is whether we supported an early adoption of a federally mandated exchange, and I do not. I think the Federal Affordable Care Act is anything but that. And if you think about Minnesota's comparative advantage over the decades, we have had a, relatively speaking, high-quality, low-cost healthcare system. We've had great education. We've had low cost of energy. And you know what we're doing? We're ceding control in all of those areas to the federal government. And if anybody thinks that this healthcare exchange gets implemented except under the careful, watchful eye and all of the design criteria of the federal government, they haven't seen the specs. And so I would absolutely argue that we hold off on deployment of that until we know the outcome of these November elections, the outcome of the Federal Affordable Care Act, and what exactly those exchanges are going to entail. It is not just a marketplace of commerce for people to buy insurance. It carries with it all of the federal requirements for what's in the coverage, who can get it, who can provide
Thank
it,
you.
and that's way more than I think we want here in Minnesota.
Thank you very much. The next question, Keith Downey starts. As an elected official, what would you do to move our state towards a clean energy future that our kids and grandkids want and need?
Well, I've always said that we need to embrace what I would call the conservation ethic of my grandparents and parents. And I think that conservation ethic, the one that I grew up with here in Minnesota, has always put a priority or a premium on balance. And that we need to balance the economic factors, the human factors, and the environmental factors. And I think a lot of what we see right now in the environmental regulatory environment at the state is overly skewed towards the environmental regulatory factors. Case in point, we have a huge opportunity to develop mines in the Iron Range. They have been waiting 6 years to open that plant. because of duplicative environmental regulatory environments at the state and the federal level. Minnesota is one of the few states that adds an environmental regulatory regime on top of the federal regime. So I think, if anything, we should be very carefully looking at where we can make improvements there without compromising that fundamental underlying ethic of conservation that we all share in Minnesota.
Thank you. All right, Melissa Franzen.
Sure. I'm a big advocate of clean energy and believe that we need to protect our environment and also diversify our fuels and think long-term, have a long-term vision of where we should be. We can't always rely on one source of energy. Natural gas is at an all-time low. And we also have to celebrate our successes of where Minnesota has come. It was under Tim Pawlenty who had vision of having a renewable standard portfolio, a standard for 25% of renewables by 2025. I believe that's a good step in the right direction. There's been actually research done by Excel Energy saying that actually did not raise prices or minimally raise prices of your utilities. So we should really look into seeing more options in that area. Minnesota could do more. We've lost competitiveness with places like Iowa in manufacturing of wind turbines, and this area can certainly do more in this area of not only wind and solar. So thank you.
All right, and here's our next question. In 2012, we'll begin with Melissa Franzen. In 2012, the legislature voted to eliminate the homestead property tax credit, raising nearly all Minnesotan homeowners' property taxes by hundreds of dollars. Bills were offered to raise revenue through cutting corporate tax loopholes, but those were not passed. What sustainable forms of revenue would you support to fund the state of Minnesota?
Great question. Well, I believe that was a short-sighted approach for our legislatures to say we're not going to be raising taxes, but we're going to be cutting programs that actually raise your property taxes. So that's just doesn't make any sense to me. I think we need to be open-minded on what solutions we need to deal with our budget and revenue issues. I think taxes should be only a last resort. Well, let's see what we're doing with the current taxes that we're in, the current revenue that's coming in. Are we being efficient? Are we being accountable? Can we stretch that dollar? Making sure we have efficiencies in place. I'm all for that, but making sure that we don't say that we're not going to take blind pledges that we're not going to raise taxes when in fact my property taxes have gone up and when in fact my fees have gone up on a variety of services. So let's not be fooled that our taxes are indeed going up.
Thank you. Keith Downey.
Thank you. Well, I think that question sounds quite a bit like an attack ad I've seen recently that was scored as misleading by NPR and WCCO. So I'm not sure that the premise is solid. We actually converted a very broken market value homestead credit program to a market value exclusion, which directed the tax relief to the lowest income people in Minnesota that have the highest need for it. And unbeknownst to most in this room, that market value homestead credit that was broken was never paid to local communities. So to argue that something that was never paid and now has been converted to an exclusion somehow drove your local property taxes just doesn't add up. So I think we need to deal with facts here. The state did in fact maintain at 2010 levels our local government aid, $2.5 billion from the state of Minnesota, the same level as it was in 2010 in the last budget. So to argue that your local property tax increases are somehow the fault of the state government, I think denies the reality of where those increases come from.
Okay, thank you. I don't know that we quite, either question got the sustainable forms of revenue answered?
Glad to answer that one.
Okay, real quickly then, thank you.
For
And
both of us?
of you,
Or-
yeah.
Oh. Should I go first then?
You know what, we'll start with Melissa Franzen.
Okay.
So your question is,
What sustainable forms of revenue would you support to fund the state of Minnesota?
well, I think we need to look at, again, come together and look and see what are our options. And it's going to take more than just one bill that says we're going to raise this or that, but one things that I think that are sustainable, again, I mentioned the e-fairness tax, where it's a bill that it basically updates our tax code, and that's where it all begins. We need to reform our tax code, and this bill would have helped with collecting internet sales tax, which is already part of what you should be doing with your state taxes, but it's just updating the law and putting some teeth and enforcing that, and again, bringing $10 million every biennium, and that's something that I think would be sustainable.
All right, thank you. And then Keith Downey?
Yeah. So we actually do have currently a sustainable tax structure. We have $2 billion more in revenue from our existing taxes coming into state coffers for the next biennium, a 6% increase just based on native economic growth in Minnesota. So if we want to increase our sustainable revenue stream at the state, we need to recover our economy, our private sector economy, as job one. And the real unsustainable structural deficit that we have is that state spending for 25 years has grown twice as fast as the rest of the economy. You can draw those lines and they don't meet out into the future. And you can try and raise taxes, but if the rate of growth of the spending is still twice the rate of growth of the revenue, you're never going to catch up. And so we have only one option for making a sustainable future for our state budget, and that's to fix that structural deficit. And the core of that is on the spending side. Look at my reform roadmap and you'll see 20 ideas where we can simply improve what we're doing to do that.
Thank you. When the stop sign comes, we got to kind of finish a little quickly. And the next question, I kind of changed the order because I hear that you would probably like to answer this next question, and it is specifically, how do we grow jobs in our state? And we'll start with Keith Downey.
Thank you. I remember the wonderful legacy that we've had in Minnesota with a very diverse economy, a dynamic financial investment environment here. And I know from my own personal experience that we have declined. You look at the tax rankings, and Minnesota is consistently in the bottom 10, the worst 10 for business tax environment, whether it's startups, whether it's big business, whether it's retirees who might be investing and deploying their human and financial capital here in this state. So number one, we need to provide some tax relief for Minnesota businesses. Number two, the environmental regulatory environment that I mentioned, and just regulation in general, and the other costs of business that exist here in Minnesota that don't in our neighboring states. That's a big difference between Iowa and Minnesota. You can start a business in 60 days over there. It takes you 2 years here in Minnesota. So if we get at those core competitive issues and provide our businesses a level playing field, guess what? Our economy is going to take off, and we're going to grow jobs the right way through the private sector.
Thank you. Melissa Franzen.
Sure, I believe that government provides the environment for businesses, private business, to create jobs, and I think that's something that we can still work on. And one of the things that I believe is missing is the private sector needs predictability. I work in business. I get it when we don't know what the state is doing with healthcare reform and how that's going to trickle down to not only large business but small business. We're all waiting for action, and we can't afford that. We need to know how much an employee is going to be costing. So we need certainty and predictability, and we need to restore confidence. So we need leadership at the legislative level to actually get things done. So that's one thing. The other piece that's crucial is the education piece and the skills gap that we all agree we still have here. My husband works in an engineering firm. He's posted an electrical engineer position. Not one person has applied. So why do we have jobs out there that we can't fill? We need to tackle that, and it's going to be working with our educators at all levels and making sure that we deal with this skills gap.
Thank you. And we'll begin the next question with Melissa Franzen. It's, what would you do to improve Minnesota's education system?
Thank you for that question. Another good segue. Well, again, the skills gap is crucial, but it also starts, it's not, we're talking about the $2.4 billion that we owe schools. And yes, it's a lot of money that we owe schools. We literally gave them an IOU, and a lot of districts had to borrow money and to make ends meet. But it's not all about money. It's not throwing money in a black hole. It's what we do with that money, and how do we make sure that we invest it in the right areas. For instance, early childhood education, when you get at least, for every dollar invested, you get an at least $8 return. Those are smart investments for the long term. Those are the type of investments that we should be making, and making sure that we consolidate what we have, and then we do more with less, because we're still coming out of a recession. So it's, again, not all about money, but it's giving our teachers and our students the tools and resources they need to succeed, and make sure that it goes all the way to the from early childhood all the way to higher ed.
Thank you. Keith Downey.
Well, I have a complete world-class graduates plan on my website that I encourage you to take a look at. I'll try and summarize it here in a minute. We have a significant problem in Minnesota in that so much of our schools' funding, over 80% on average, runs through the state bureaucracy. And so the Minnesota Miracle that worked quite well when we were pumping more money into the existing structures 40 years ago is showing some serious cracks. And the big reason is the union bureaucratic complex essentially runs every dollar that comes through the state government. And our superintendent will tell you that 85% of the decisions that they make are dictated by the state. So we have a local control issue and a fixing of the funding formula issue that we need to address. And then for schools that are really struggling, there's a series of reforms that we need to implement to pay and compensate teachers for achievement and student performance, not just seniority, to retain teachers, not based just on seniority, but based on competency and their
Thank you.
students' achievement. Those are the things that'll advance the
Thank you.
struggling districts.
We unfortunately just have to finish the sentence when the timer goes up. Thank you very much. The next question with Keith Downey. Please describe how you embody the unique voice of Edina, which has traditionally been fiscally conservative but socially moderate.
Well, I guess I'll let the voters decide whether I embody that or not. I'm not going to pretend to stand here and tell you why you should think that. I think I represent Edina in that I have been born and raised here. I think I represent Minnesota in the fact that my grandparents and my parents raised me with that tried and true Minnesota ethic. That you tell the truth, that you take responsibility for your actions, that you get a good education, that you take care of your family, that you give back to your community, and you love your neighbor. And I'll do my best to embody that and honor that legacy with everything I have in the state legislature. And we might differ over the means, but we do not differ over the ends that we all want for our state. And so to the extent that I do that well, I would thank you for your vote. To the extent that you might disagree with that, I certainly welcome your feedback to let me know where you disagree with me, but I'm not going to presume to tell you.
Thank you so much. And Melissa Franson.
Can you repeat the question, please?
Yes. Please describe how you embody the unique voice of Edina, which has traditionally been fiscally conservative but socially moderate.
Sure. Well, I feel like I am certainly that voice in myself and my own values of being fiscally responsible and socially more moderate. When I've been talking to a lot of you over the course of since April, door knocking in the district, and that is what I've heard, that this is that fiscal actions and fiscal responsibility matters to you, and that my message that I've shared with you as well, that we do need to tackle our budget and think long term and balance our budget responsibly. Those are all things that we all hold dear, and we need to make sure that we're accountable and honest about how we do that. So I think what I can offer this district and all of you who I've been talking to over the months is that I will be honest and transparent of how we get to the goals, but that I'm on your side in terms of making sure that we achieve those goals and have an open door and open dialogue, as I've done so far, talking to thousands of you every day. And I've enjoyed the conversations, and I look forward to continuing to hear what's important to you.
All right, thank you. And the next question is, what is your position on any gun control laws, is the question,
That me, I guess.
which I think is a hard one to answer because it's not specific, is it?
Well, there's a Second Amendment in the Constitution that grants us the rights to bear arms. I think that's settled law. At the local level, unfortunately, it might be referring to the tragic incident in our community last week with the tragic death of 6 individuals that resulted out of workplace violence, and it's a tragedy, and we don't want to jump into conclusions and what was the motive and what made this tragedy happen, but we need to do the best we can to prevent that. That doesn't mean that we're going to jump into having more stringent laws on our guns. I think we just stay the course and make sure that we do what we need to do, whether it's at the mental health level or other areas that we need to tackle. But it's also, when we have a tragedy, we sometimes jump to over-regulate and over-prescribe legislation to fix an issue, when in fact we need to make sure that we know what's needed to prevent any tragedy like this to ever happen again.
Thank you. Keith Downey.
Thank you. Yeah, I think we might agree quite a lot on that one. We do have a Second Amendment in our Constitution. It has been interpreted extensively by the Supreme Court, and we have a body of law here in Minnesota that's entirely consistent with the gun control regulations of other states, and all, again, appropriate according to the U.S. Supreme Court under the U.S. Constitution. So absent trying to get into hypothetical situations here or speculation about what the questioner was thinking about in terms of specific laws, I'll just stick with that. It's in the Constitution. I support the right to bear arms, and I think we have a nice body of law here in Minnesota to support that.
Thank you very much. The next question is to Keith Downey, and here's the question. In 2011, the Wisconsin governor proposed and the Wisconsin legislature passed a bill to eliminate collective bargaining rights for public sector workers. What is your opinion of collective bargaining rights from both a constitutional and moral point of view?
Well, I think collective bargaining certainly has its place, and there's a freedom of employment dimension, I think, to our democracy that's very important to protect. And I personally favor what is commonly called a right to work amendment that would simply say that any employee has the freedom to join or not join a union. And if they choose to not join a union, they cannot be compelled to pay union dues. And in that environment, I think collective bargaining has its rightful place. The organization of workers, the development of unions that add value to customers and employers and employees, all would flourish under that kind of a regime. What we have right now, especially in state government, is an excessive regulatory environment, the Public Employee Labor Relations Act, which frankly gives public workers too much leverage in the equation, including the fact that they can elect the people who will sit on the other side of the negotiating table at bargaining time. So I think we have excesses there in the public sector.
Thank you. Melissa Franzen.
Sure. Well, I think there really isn't need for a right-to-work state because federally we do have a law that applies to all of us, and that's the National Labor Relations Act, which allows us to, any one of us, to collectively bargain if we so choose to. I do believe in the right to collective bargain. I believe that we shouldn't be tipping the scale one way or the other. Just as much as businesses negotiate for their contracts, I think labor has the right to negotiate for theirs, and keeping a fair and balanced approach. I don't see a need for right to work in Minnesota, and I believe that the National Labor Relations Act, like I mentioned, is already something that is in place and protects anybody's rights to collective bargain.
Thank you. And here's the next question. When there is an impasse on the state budgeting process, what would you do to prevent a state shutdown? Melissa Franzen.
Well, I wouldn't give up is the first thing I would say, because we owe that to the people, that every taxpayer, to every public employee, to every business, because we're all interconnected. And by closing up the government and acting like it's a nice experiment to figure out what's essential and what's not, that's irresponsible. I don't think that's something that we ever should get to, and it should probably never happen again if we actually elect people who are going to work hard and make sure that never happens. So it's something that that for me is one of the reasons I decided to run for office. It's one of the first red flags I saw in the last couple of years where I said, this is enough. We need people who are going to work together. Either extreme is not good for Minnesota, so we need people who are going to work with the other side and make sure that we find some compromises to move Minnesota forward. That actually having the record of the longest government shutdown and the record of the most government shutdown is not something that I'm proud of.
Thank you. Keith Downey.
Thanks. I think we had a situation in the last budgeting cycle that represented the fact that we had a $6 billion budget gap. The voters of Minnesota, in their wisdom, elected what was arguably the most liberal Democratic governor and the most conservative Republican legislature. And as you might imagine, when those forces engaged at the legislature, it was going to be a tough battle. And I think you could place blame on a lot of different sides. I've seen the blame placed squarely on the legislature side here tonight and again in other attack ads. You know, the reality is the governor didn't negotiate our bills literally for 3 months. He vetoed an entirely balanced budget that didn't raise taxes the day after the legislature adjourned. He refused a compromise offer that added $1.5 billion of new spending into the budget 2 days before the shutdown, and 3 weeks after the shutdown accepted that exact same deal. So I think to hold that it was the legislature's fault and somehow one person in the legislature
Thank you.
on the side of the governor would correct that,
Thank
I
you.
think is false.
Okay. So let's see here. We've got to go to the next one here. What reforms on redistricting would you support to avoid the problems and the expenses we experienced this year? And that will begin with Melissa Franson.
I think
No, I'm
Actually, I think
sorry.
it goes
No,
to
Keith
me,
Downey.
yeah.
Got it wrong. Sorry.
So I don't mind that we have a legislative process to determine redistricting. I know there have been proposals about organizing a separate commission as though that would somehow take the politics out of it. I got to tell you, separate commissions have just as much politics as the legislative process, and to have people who are actually accountable to the voters in charge, I think makes better sense. And so I think this sense that somehow the legislature is the source of all of these problems, which we've started to hear again and again tonight, is a real problem. And what I'm not hearing from my opponent, frankly, are concrete answers to whether or not she would support tax increases, the tax increases that Governor Dayton has proposed, whether she would support Public Employee Labor Relations Act reform so that unions don't control the people that they're negotiating with across the table. She's talked about providing the level playing field that businesses want, and yet supports the most onerous regulatory regime in federal history under
The question was, what
ACA.
reforms on redistricting would you support to avoid the problems?
I think I have a minute,
Oh,
right?
okay. Yeah, I just want to make sure that you're answering the question.
Yeah, no,
Thank
I
you.
think
Okay.
the question is of a type that says the legislature is the problem with many
Okay.
things, so I was broadening the answer.
Okay, yeah, I just kind of went over a little bit before. I just want to make sure that you're answering the
1
questions.
minute answers are very difficult.
Yeah,
you know.
okay. Thank you. Melissa Franson.
Sure. And I wasn't in the legislature, not an excuse, but I'm not as familiar as how the redistricting actually works and the whole negotiating. I know that we had a plan that came from the Democrats, a plan that came from the Republicans. I would assume that they were both really far apart, and that's why it went to the judicial system to tackle it out. I do know we need to make sure that those systems and that we redistrict in a way that it doesn't hurt our constituents, and that would be my focus in making sure that whatever that process is, that we are making sure that at the end of the day, we're not making our constituents having a unfavorable landscape of where they're going to be voting. So as for our district, it didn't change much, so I thought that was okay, but other districts did change dramatically, and it's something that happens every 10 years, and making sure that it's fair is what I would focus on.
All right, thank you. How much local government aid should the state of Minnesota provide? It's kind of a expansive question, but basically, should the state continue to provide local government aid, what I think is probably the better question.
And I believe that for the most part, local government aid doesn't go to every city. So it comes to the state, and some cities get it, some cities don't. So what's the point of if it's not going to actually get back to your city? I think it can be looked at again and making sure that it's fair in a realistic way of funding our governments, but at the same time, making sure that at the state level, we do have a better visibility of where those funds should be going. So I'd hope that we look at individually, case by case, making sure that those funds are going where they need to go, and it's transparent.
Thank you. Keith Downey.
As I mentioned before, we actually appropriated $2.5 billion in local government aid from the state to local municipalities and counties, and that is equal to the amount that we had in 2010. So if part of the question was, have we reduced it, we haven't. And I think that's an open debate. I actually have a bill, and it's referred to in the reform roadmap that's out in the table there, that would actually reform local government aid. The big part of the problem is that we simply distribute that aid based on a formula on population and geography and other factors. My proposal says that we should turn local government aid, at least half of it, into a grant-based process where we would look specifically at the needs of these communities, that all of the money would have to go to water and core infrastructure and public safety, not all the other things that it gets spent on, and that some portion of the local government aid should be distributed to communities that are coming together in shared service arrangements as compared to actually favoring, like it does right now, those arrangements where people are doing things individually.
Thank you. All right, we are getting towards the end here. I'm going to just ask one quick question, and that is, of all, you've been asked a lot of questions. Is there any question that you would have liked to have been asked tonight, and why? Just think of one question you would have liked to have been asked tonight, and why. And that will start with
me?
Keith Downey, yeah?
Sure. The question I think should have been asked, and it's the fundamental one that we faced in the legislature last year, and it's the fundamental one we're going to face in the legislature over the next 2 years, and that is, would you support Governor Dayton's calls for increases in taxes? We have not heard any discussion of that. We have heard very little discussion on the core issues that I'm hearing at the door, which is the private sector economy and whether or not we should be growing our state government, both in terms of the tax revenue that we take in, the spending that we do, its involvement in our private economy, the regulatory regimes that it spawns. I mean, we have a governor that literally tried to unilaterally unionize an entire home-based cottage industry, along with the tax increases. We have a governor who's advertising Minnesota as the state that you come to if you want your taxes raised, your government spending increased, and entire industries unionized. We haven't heard anything about those key, fundamental, critical questions tonight, and frankly, we haven't heard a single answer from my opponent that tells us whether she would support Governor Dayton in those issues.
Thank you very much. Melissa Franson.
Sure. The question I would have liked to answer was, what makes you a moderate Democrat? Which to me is, I don't have to agree with everything in my party. I don't have to agree with every leader in my party. I have an independent mind, and that is what makes me a moderate Democrat. So to your point, Mr. Downey, in terms of where I stand on these issues, I'm not cut by the same mold. So I will look at each issue on a case-by-case basis. That is what is, I think, the responsible way to do. I am not a robot, so I will not be voting party line if my district is not in that direction. And that is my vow and trust that I hope I get from the people of Edina, West Bloomington, Eden Prairie, Minnetonka, to represent your interests, not that of the party.
Thank you. Well, we are now at the closing remarks point of the program, and we will begin with Keith Downey for the closing remarks.
Well, thanks for a chance to come before the good folks of Edina and share our views and our perspectives. You know, the reality is we have dug ourselves a really big hole. We have a struggling economy. We have a federal government with $16 trillion of debt and unfunded liabilities that are approaching $100 trillion. That's over $300,000 for every person in this room with no means to pay for it. And so I think the fundamental question before us in this Senate race and in the 4 years that either of us would be in the Senate is, how do you address that with good conscience and with good strategic thinking and with good pragmatic budgeting at the state of Minnesota? And if you think that pouring more money into the status quo is the solution, if you think that we should double down at the state of Minnesota on the debt and the deficits that we've incurred at the federal level, if you think that we should raise taxes on our private sector employers, small businesses, and families, if you think that our state government should be more involved in regulatory regimes, then I think you should probably vote for my opponent. I'm here to tell you that we have huge problems in state government. You cannot grow these bureaucracies twice as fast as the rest of the economy and think it's ever going to be sustainable. These are big, complex challenges. The solutions are tough. The politics of the solutions are tough. And you got to get in there and have real ideas. I've got a budget proposal that solves our budget deficit and pays down our school shift without paying taxes. I've got a reform roadmap based on my business experience that has 20 concrete ideas where state government is literally 20 to 30 years behind the private sector in reforming and fixing what they do. People, we can do this. We can get out from under this huge cloud that's over us, but you know what? It's a lot of hard work, and there are tough decisions and tough negotiations, and it won't be easy. But I'm telling you, if we apply our Minnesota ethic, we can do it, and we will do it, and I will be in the middle of that if I'm elected as your state senator. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Melissa Franzen.
Thank you. We have a great community and a great state, but we can do better than the results that we have seen from my opponent. His track record is taking Minnesota backwards. Thanks to my opponent and the legislative leadership, we've had the longest government shutdown on record, a downgrade of our AAA credit rating, gimmicks and accounting tricks to create illusions of a balanced budget, a bill that would repeal pay equity for women, and divisive constitutional amendments. Those are not our priorities. Let me give you a brief background about myself and how I was raised. I was raised as a middle-class family. My dad was a cop, my mother an educator. My parents wanted to provide my two sisters and I with the best education possible, and they made sacrifices for that. It was not unusual to see my mother go to 2 to 3 different grocery stores to get the best deals, or pack a lunch when we went on vacation. At the end of the day, I knew that they were making smart sacrifices because they wanted us, 3 girls, to have the best education possible. They never compromised on their goal. And as your state senator, I will not either. I'm prepared to make the difficult sacrifices and the difficult choices that we will need to make. But I will never lose sight of the goals for our district, to strengthen our sense of optimism and confidence for the future of the district and for the state of Minnesota. To give you the straight story about the challenges and the opportunities that we face. To make smart long-term investments in our community, our schools, our businesses, and our infrastructure. Our disagreements should not end in gridlock and inaction. It should serve as a challenge to work harder to find the sensible solutions to move the District of Minnesota and Minnesota in the right direction. I ask for your vote on November 6th so we can get to work.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And thanks also to the League of Women Voters of Edina for sponsoring this forum. The forum has been taped for broadcast on Edina Community Channel 16 and will be shown Fridays at 11 p.m. and on Saturdays at 7 a.m. and 3 p.m. until Election Day. The forum will be available for viewing on the internet through the City of Edina at www.edinamn.gov. For more information on voting and the candidates, please visit League of Women Voters Minnesota's election website at www.vote411.org. And finally, I want to thank the candidates for participating and their willingness to participate in the democratic process by running for office. And let's give them a big round of applause. And thank you to the audience for being here and the audience at home. Thank you very much.